So after the most recent Diablo showcase, we now have a pretty good idea of what the new endgame of Diablo 4 is going to entail once the second expansion is released. And this includes things like actually adding some pretty significant meta progression to all of the endgame pieces of content. This includes pretty much completely changing up how we actually partake in the endgame, and then including some new endgame content, specifically with the new Echoing Hatred Infinite Horde mode. So I want to go over all the information we have on that now, because even though the developers didn't specifically mention some of the things we're going over in this video, we actually did get to take a look at it from the footage they released. Now, before we get into the Warplans, which includes the new endgame skill trees for all of the different pieces of content, I figured we should go over the new piece of endgame content first, and this is going to be the Echoing Hatred system. Now, this is essentially an infinite horde mode where the longer you stay alive, the more quickly you can defeat enemies, and the more tiers you get through, the more loot you actually obtain. Now, Echoing Hatred as a system is going to be more of a reward to actually enter it, meaning I think it's probably going to be pretty heavily juiced on the rewards. Because to even enter Echoing Hatred, you need to get a very rare ticket from pretty much anything you do in the game, and if you get that ticket, you can then go and enter Echoing Hatred. Now, what it seems like is Echoing Hatred is just a big room. It seems to have a bunch of pylons in all of the corners, and then waves and waves of enemies will constantly spawn, and you have to keep defeating them, and then that just continues until you die, or until there's too many enemies that you haven't defeated, because there is a bar that if it fills up, it seems like you also fail. So it's not only about surviving longer and longer, it's also about having enough damage to continue to be able to clear out the enemies without them stacking up too much. And this is not only going to probably be a fun piece of content, because all of the enemies spawning in are also randomized, and it can just spawn in like any boss in the game, or at least a good chunk of bosses in the game. You could even be facing multiple bosses at a time. So it's seemingly going to be decently fun, at least. I'm wondering if the different pylons in the corners refresh at certain points. Like, do they refresh every tier, or is it just those 4 pylons or shrines for the entirety of that run? But outside of it seeming to be pretty fun because of all the randomized elements, you could also pretty heavily test your build against this content. Just because of how this system works, you'll be able to test your build. You'll be able to see what tier you can get to, and as your build gets stronger and stronger, you'll be able to just keep getting higher and higher tiers in these Echoing Hatred runs. What's also pretty interesting is at the end of it, you actually get to see the stats of the run you just did, and then your personal best. So they have tier reached, they have monsters killed, and they have bosses killed. So you'll be able to keep track of a little bit of the stats, the more important ones of this run. So you can really just keep trying to test your build against itself and the other builds you may have made on that character to see how high of a tier you could actually get to. And as you become stronger and stronger, you'll actually get more loot. And what's interesting is at the end of this run, we got to see in the footage, this person got to tier 50, they killed 749 monsters, and they killed 7 bosses. And the reason the bosses is interesting is because at the end they got a bunch of legendaries, but then they also got 7 goblins plunder. So seems to be these big bags of loot, no idea what would come in them, but those seem to be based upon how many bosses they killed, because they killed 7 and they got 7 of these goblins plunder. So it seems that within the randomization, getting bosses will potentially be really good. Now, I'm assuming that the bosses will generally be more difficult than just random other enemies, but if they give big bags of loot at the end, you actually want to get more and more bosses. So getting higher and higher tier will just kind of be multiplying the loot you can actually get. Now, the final thing to note with this Echoing Hatred content is that as you're going through it, you'll see your difficulty increase. Now, you'll see in the footage of when we're looking at the loot this person got at the end is that they're in Torment 5. Now, for whatever reason, I've seen a bunch of people trying to say that this means Torment 5 is coming with the expansion. We don't actually know that because this system works differently. In the footage, we actually see this person go through the non-torment difficulties when they first start off in Echoing Hatred. So you're going to start off in the lowest difficulty, you're going to go up, you're going to go through normal, you're going to go through Pentium, you're going to go through expert, and then you're going to get into the torment tiers as you keep going tier by tier in this specific piece of endgame content. So again, Echoing Hatred is infinite, so seeing your difficulty increase can kind of give you a look at what difficulty you're actually facing facing compared to the rest of the game. This doesn't mean we're getting higher torment tiers yet. We know higher torment tiers are something that are planned for the game's future, but we don't know if that is actually coming with the expansion. It doesn't necessarily seem to be, because the only time we've seen above Torment 4 is specifically in this Echoing Hatred content. But that brings us to the star of the show that's going to completely change all of the endgame content of Diablo 4, and that is the Warplans system that also includes the new endgame skill trees for all of the endgame content. Now, at a baseline, the Warplans system is essentially what is going to put you into the actual pieces of content where you go defeat enemies. It is essentially creating a playlist of 5 different activities that you choose that can also give different rewards and additional rewards that you wouldn't get before, and you select your path with these 5 different activities. You start them, you go complete all of those activities, getting all the rewards, and then you will go to the next rank of the Warplans system. Now, as you'll see, this UI kind of looks like something you could expect from almost like a roguelike. A lot of roguelikes use a system like this, where you kind of select your path throughout these different things, and you have a few different paths you can select through, whether it be different pieces of content or because you want a different reward. Now, the developers did also say in a recent Q&A that the Warplans system itself, this UI, will get bigger as you progress more and more through it, and it wasn't clear if they were meaning that it got longer, and presumably because you're selecting 5 different activities, the Warplans system will probably get bigger as in wider, giving you more options to choose between, not necessarily longer, because with you selecting seemingly only 5 activities no matter what, it's probably going to be 5 different tiers that will probably just open up the tiers so you have more options in each tier. And you'll also notice that at the top of the Warplans there is a rank, which is what I mentioned. It's seeming that as you go and complete those 5 activities, it puts you into the next rank. This one's showing rank out of 10. We don't know if maybe you'll be able to go above rank 10, or maybe it'll always be capped at rank 10, and then once you get to rank 10 it resets, or maybe you just keep going at rank 10. It also says below that if you complete 2 out of 4 Warplans, it improves their rewards. So seeming to mean that as you progress throughout your Warplans more and more, you get more and more rewards. Also, before we actually got the spotlight, the official descriptions we got of the Warplans system is that you will be able to apply different affixes and increase the difficulty of the content while getting more and more rewards. And while you can do this in the skill tree system, it also seems that Warplans will just be scaling the loot and probably difficulty of all of this endgame content itself, just as you keep going more and more through the ranks. Because at the bottom, you can just reset the plan and create a new one. So it seems that as you get more and more ranks, it probably gets more difficult, and that's why you're able to readily just reset it and start up a new plan, because if you get to a point that it's too difficult, they need a way for you to be able to go back without that higher difficulty. That's really the only reason I could see them doing this. If it's just giving more and more rewards and not increasing the difficulty, you really wouldn't need to be able to reset. So I think at a baseline, we could think of the Warplans system as really just choosing the activities you're doing, which can also just give you different rewards than you're normally used to. And as you do more and more of it, it increases the rewards and the difficulty. So this is kind of at a baseline, kind of scaling everything you're doing. Now, the Warplan activities in conjunction with the new endgame skill trees is really where this system gets interesting. So alongside the Warplan system, there will be a skill tree for every piece of endgame content, seemingly except for Echoing Hatred. Now, that's one of the reasons I want to go over Echoing Hatred first. Echoing Hatred, again, seems to be more of a reward thing, and they don't seem to have a skill tree for that right now. Maybe it'll be added in the future, or maybe because of what type of system it is and how it's designed, you can't really augment it too much. It may also be that Echoing Hatred is so juiced up already, as it's a very rare drop to be able to even enter it, that they don't really need a skill tree adding more modifiers or things on top of it. But all of the other 7 endgame pieces of content exist with these skill trees. So you have the pit, you have the lair bosses, you have hell tides, you have the whisper system, you have the undercity, you have nightmare dungeons, and you have infernal hordes. Every single one of those pieces of content has their own skill tree that you get progression from while going through the Warplane system. So let's say you choose one of your activities as a hell tide, you go complete that, it'll give you a reward from completing that, and then it'll give you a certain amount of activity experience, and getting enough activity the experience will give you a skill point to put into the skill tree of that specific piece of endgame content. And there's seemingly a lot of things these skill trees can do. We know they can kind of completely change the loot you're actually getting from an activity. One of the examples is in Infernal Hordes. One of the upgrades you can get is you no longer gain gem fragments in Infernal Hordes and instead gain bonus Opticite. So you're completely removing one piece of loot you can get from Infernal Hordes and just massively buffing up Opticite. And you do get gem fragments every wave you complete in Infernal Hordes, so presumably those will be removed for Opticite. And then at the end, if you choose the resource chest or the material chest, that also gives a ridiculous amount of gem fragments, so those would pretty much all be turned into Opticite, kind of completely changing the loot you're going for in that system. Now we also did get to see that in some of these skill trees, you're not actually going to be augmenting that piece of content yourself. You're essentially going to be allowing that type of content to exist in other pieces of endgame content. So more specifically, we get to see a few upgrades for the layer boss skill tree, one of them being the Beast's Assault. When fighting a boss in a nightmare dungeon, the Beast in Ice can sometimes appear and attack you. Killing a boss that the Beast in Ice is assisting has a chance to drop unique items from the Beast in Ice's layer boss horde chest. So you're not actually buffing up or augmenting layer bosses themselves with this upgrade. You're actually just adding the chance for layer bosses to appear in another piece of content, this being in a nightmare dungeon. Then we also got to see Astaroth's Amalgam, which is actually the upgrade right below it. So it does seem like this side of the layer boss skill tree is specifically for adding layer bosses to other content. But this one is the Amalgam of Rage can ambush you during a boss fight within a nightmare dungeon. Killing the Amalgam of Rage in a nightmare dungeon can drop unique items associated with Astaroth. And I'm also pretty certain that this is actually revealing that Astaroth is now going to be an endgame boss in the boss ladder itself. So as a layer boss, because right now we can only face Astaroth at the end of an escalation nightmare dungeon sigil. So you get the escalation sigil from the Heroic Strong Room, you go through the 3 nightmare dungeon runs, and then at the end you face Astaroth, who will give you kind of randomized loot depending on what affixes it randomly rolls. And right now he doesn't really have uniques that are like specifically farmed from him. So I think based upon how this is describing it, Astaroth is also now going to be a layer boss, but now he can just randomly appear as you're facing any boss in any nightmare dungeon. So again, just adding the chance for any layer bosses to appear in other pieces of content, which is also really interesting. Now, it does also seem that the amount of skill points you can get for these endgame skill trees is going to be pretty limited. As of right now, it seems you can only get 7 levels into these, meaning 7 points. And all of these skill trees have a lot more than 7 points. I think the smallest one is for the Undercity. It only has 11, but it seems that most of the other skill trees have around 17. So it seems that for most of the skill trees, you can't even get half of the potential upgrades, meaning you really have to choose what you're actually wanting to go for and what you're actually wanting to farm when you're going into that content. And it also seems that in a lot of these skill trees, they're kind of sectioned off from each other. Like for instance, this Helltide skill tree, you go on the right side, it has all red upgrades that don't connect to any of the other sides. You go down the left side, it's all yellow upgrades that don't connect to anything. You go down the middle, it's all orange upgrades that don't connect to anything. So it seems that they are kind of color coded, and it seems that the different sections of the skill trees are probably focused on doing different things. So one section may be more focused on buffing up loot or changing the loot. One may be more focused on maybe augmenting the content you come across. They did mention that you would even be able to change the density of enemies in certain content. So there's quite a lot of interesting things. Now the developers have also said that previous seasonal content would also be within some of these skill trees. So maybe you'd get an upgrade that would add some seasonal piece of content to that endgame system, which would probably add different pieces of loot and just different things you could do. And one of the big examples that they didn't specifically say, but they showed, is that in a Helltide, they showed a Chaos Rift opening up in that Helltide, spewing out Chaos monsters. If you remember, Chaos Rifts were all over Helltides during that season. It seems like within these skill trees, you will be able to add previous seasonal pieces of content within those systems. So it seems that you really are going to be able to customize these pieces of endgame content by adding new things, changing changing the loot, even adding content from other things into that. So for instance, we went over some of the things in the layer boss skill tree where you can add layer bosses or give a chance of layer bosses to exist in other content. More than likely, a lot of these endgame systems are also going to have things like that. So maybe you really like doing one thing. Maybe you really like doing Helltide or really like doing Nightmare Dungeons. Maybe in a bunch of the other skill trees, there'll be upgrades you can take that can add content from that endgame system into the thing you really like doing. So you'll focus on all those upgrades and then you just go to the content you really like doing, and it's completely juiced because now you have things being added from all of the other systems into it. Because that's also one thing I've seen a bunch of comments on where people are thinking this really isn't changing the endgame content that much or not adding anything new to it. There's going to be tons of different things you'll be able to add through these skill trees to completely change up how that content actually works. Not just what type of loot you get or how much loot you get, actually adding new piece of content. Like just being able to go into the upgrade through your skill tree that adds Rift Tides back to Hell Tides will be a pretty massive increase, especially when you consider there will also always be a new season. So there'll probably be some new season that adds some new piece of content to like Hell Tides again. Now you'll have this big skill tree with a bunch of other things you put into Hell Tides already. Now there's this new seasonal thing on top of that to where Hell Tides could just get absolutely ridiculous with how much stuff is in them. And this can exist for every piece of endgame content. So I think the Warplane system with the new skill trees is going to completely change the endgame of Diablo 4. That I think already has a good amount of endgame systems that are now going to just be completely customizable. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.